The first snow of winter came down in hard flakes the morning Elijah Bryan walked into Tether's End. A weathered town clawing at the edge of Wyoming territory, it leaned heavy into wind and bone, nestled in the crook of the Red Claw Range. 27 buildings, one church, two saloons, and a schoolhouse that hadn't been painted since President Grant took the oath. Elijah had taught there 5 years. The children knew to sit still, speak plain, and never cheat. He'd caught the Howard twins swapping slate boards in '73 and made them write every verse of Leviticus by hand. Folks in town liked Elijah well enough. Quiet man. Carried his sorrow like a bundle tied tight and neat. Never married, no family to speak of, but no one asked much. Tether's End wasn't a place where people poked after pain. On the third Wednesday of December, the sky bruised dark and early. Elijah let the pupils go at noon. He swept the schoolroom floor, banked the stove, and buttoned his coat up to his throat. At the Hollow Briar Cafe, a half-tin, half-seater diner that served coffee thick as oil, he took his usual seat near the back, beneath a peeling painting of a stag. He was halfway through a plate of beans and cornbread when the stranger came in. The man moved like someone who had slept on saddle leather more often than linen. He wore a brimmed hat low over his face and a duster coat soaked dark with snow melt. Long shadows clung to him. Nobody noticed, not really. Or rather, nobody reacted. Tether's End had seen worse visitors. The war had left its mark across the faces of most men over 30. Elijah glanced once, then went back to eating. The stranger asked for stew, sat near the stove, and waited. It wasn't until the wind howled loud enough to rattle the windows that Elijah looked up again. The cafe was emptying. Mrs. Leary, the owner, was busy wiping the bar. The only seat left not caught in a draft was across from Elijah. "You can sit here if you like," Elijah offered, voice even. He gestured with his fork. The man hesitated, then lowered himself slowly, as if unused to small kindnesses. Up close, Elijah saw the threads of silver in the man's hair and the etched lines around his eyes, an age that had nothing to do with years. "Appreciate it," the man said. His voice was clean gravel, firm but calm. They ate in silence for a while, steam rising from their plates. The man didn't fidget or ask questions. Elijah liked that. "Name, Elijah Bryan," he said eventually. "I teach down at the school." The man nodded, finished chewing, then replied, "Call me Ash." Ash, no surname, no explanation. That night, Elijah walked home and thought little of it. Ash had said little, thanked him for the seat, paid in coin that clinked heavy, and vanished into the falling snow. But 3 days later, Ash came to the schoolhouse. He stood at the back, quiet, hat in hand, as Elijah taught arithmetic. When the lesson ended, he waited for the children to file out before speaking. "You got any help here?" Ash asked. "Not since Margaret Boyle married and moved east. I do it alone." Ash nodded again. "If you ever need repairs, fences. Wood chopped. I'm staying out by Miller's barn for now." Elijah didn't ask why a man who walked like a gunslinger wanted to fix fences. He just said, "I'll keep that in mind." Weeks passed, winter gnawed deep. Ash showed up every few days, bringing fresh venison or fixing the cracked window pane in the school. He didn't speak much, but when he did, it was steady and full of thought. Elijah came to respect the man, though he still didn't know more than 5 things about him. Then one night, after a snowfall so thick the town seemed buried in ghost sheets, Elijah saw Ash sitting outside the cafe with his coat unbuttoned and his hands bare, staring up at the mountains like they owed him something. "You all right?" Elijah asked, stepping out into the cold. Ash didn't move. "This place used to be fire and blood," he murmured. "I came through here in '68, different name then. Different life." Elijah sat beside him on the bench, heart ticking fast. "War." Ash shook his head. "Worse, ranchers, greed. I lost a boy here once, thought I'd buried it." The name Ash was a grave then, a choice, not a man but what was left of one. That was the first time Elijah realized the man might be someone he ought to fear, not because of what Ash had done, but because of what he hadn't yet. That winter, someone started buying up land north of Tether's End. Quiet purchases done through lawyers and distant banks. The locals whispered it was a new cattle syndicate, maybe a railroad's front, but no one knew for certain. And Elijah, though he didn't say it aloud, began to wonder if the richest rancher in the West wasn't sleeping in a hayloft outside town, eating stew in the corner booth, and slowly unearthing the bones he'd buried beneath snow and silence. Spring didn't arrive so much as it crept, like something ashamed of itself. Snow gave way to mud, and the mountains bled their cold into the rivers. Children shed their wool hats and began bringing frogs into the schoolhouse again. Elijah Bynes swept them out without comment. Ash stayed. He built a linta behind Miller's barn, then improved it into something sturdier, a stove, a roof of cedar shingles. He took odd jobs no one asked him to. Replaced split boards on the church pews. Shod Farmer Penrick's mule when the smith fell ill. Quiet, capable work, but he was watching. That became clear, not the town, not the people, at least not exactly. He watched the land. Stood at the edge of fields with his arms crossed, eyes sweeping over the hills. He asked questions only a man born to livestock and barbed wire would think to ask. How long that stream been drying early? You ever seen that pasture get sweetgrass this thin? What do they call that ridge south of Bell's Wash? Elijah answered what he could. The rest he learned. On the second Sunday after thaw, Elijah walked into the cafe and found Ash already seated. Same corner booth. This time, though, he wasn't alone. A woman sat across from him. Auburn hair, eyes like polished shale. She wore a green riding coat and held a pencil over a folded map. They were whispering when Elijah approached, but both fell silent the moment they saw him. Ash nodded at him. Elijah, sit if you like. The woman said nothing. She studied Elijah with the same sharp appraisal ranchers gave breeding stock. Not cruel, not warm, just measuring. Elijah, Ash said after a beat, this is Josette Lang. She's helping me reacquire some family holdings. Elijah blinked. The term was too polite to be honest. Family holdings. Ash folded his hands. There's land north of here that was once mine, my father's before him. I aim to set that right. Josette added it was stolen in the summer of '68. Falsified titles, burned records, we've tracked every deed change since. Elijah looked between them. Ash, with his worn coat and simple words. Josette with her ledger-stained fingers and Eastern education. He understood then, Ash wasn't just a rancher, he was an empire in exile. Why now? Elijah asked. Ash sipped his coffee before answering. Because the men who took it are dying. And the sons they left behind don't know what it cost. They walk the land like they earned it. The next week, 3 things happened. First, a lawyer from Casper rode into town and posted notices claiming legal ownership of 2 ranches near Salt Ridge. The documents were precise, seals intact. Second, both ranches, Jameson Creek and the Old Wetherill Spread, sold for sums so high folks whispered about gold beneath the soil. Third, the lawyer vanished, just gone. Took his horse, left his briefcase behind at the inn. The sheriff rode out and found nothing but hooves in the mud and a hat snagged in pine branches near the gorge. Elijah didn't ask Ash about it. He didn't need to. The cafe remained their place. Quiet meals, short talk. Occasionally, Josette joined. She seemed to warm to Elijah over time, though she never called him by name, just teacher, like it was a title she found useful. It was Josette who began probing the townsfolk. Gentle questions at first. She spoke to widows, to retired ranch hands. She asked about fences moved, springs diverted, barns burned in the bad years. She was patient but relentless. You think people will care? Elijah asked one night as they walked together past the schoolhouse. Care, she echoed, about who owns the land, about the past. She stopped. They'll care when the land feeds fewer mouths than it did before. When winter bites harder. When a name that was supposed to be buried shows up on their water rights. Ash caught up with them a few paces later. He looked tired that night, not weary but used, like a man pulling too many threads at once. You were right about the ridge south of Bell's Wash, he told Elijah. The deed calls it Old Low Bluff, but before the war it was part of the Daltrey Herd Range. That's where they drove the cattle through in summer. Until Daltrey got burned out. Who burned him? Elijah asked. Ash looked toward the moonlit peaks. Me, or the man I was forced to be. That was the closest he came to admitting what he'd done. Not a confession, but a tally mark in blood. The land began to change, slowly, then all at once. New fences appeared, straighter than before. Cattle drifted westward without prompting. A dam was repaired near Crooked Pine, one no one remembered fixing. And men with unmarked hats began riding the edges of town, never dismounting, always watching. The preacher called it divine correction. The mayor called it coincidence. Elijah said nothing, because he knew a judgment when he saw one. And Ash, the man who'd sat quiet at his table 5 months before, was no drifter now. He was the reckoning long overdue. By mid-May, the first retaliations began, not with bullets, those would come later, but with smaller punishments. The bank stopped honoring certain withdrawal notes. Mrs. Harper, who leased grazing ground on the western ridge, found her access gate padlocked and her permit revoked. Elijah heard rumors that the mayor was paid a visit late one night by 2 men who smelled like whiskey but spoke like lawyers. And still Ash said little. He moved through town like a man born to long shadows and quiet storms. He taught Elijah how to read a cattle brand by scar patterns, how to tell when a waterhole was being poisoned slow, not all at once. They spoke of border law and dust erosion, and always in the back of Elijah's mind beat one steady truth. The richest rancher in the West was walking these roads without title or weapon, reshaping a map the town didn't know had been redrawn. One afternoon, Elijah found Ash sitting beside Josette under the hanging limb of a juniper tree beyond the schoolyard. A bundle of documents lay between them, half unrolled across a blanket. They moved it, Josette was saying, jabbing at a corner of a survey, 2 miles west after the raid. Enough to claim the spring, enough to block passage. They knew what they were doing, Ash replied, every inch of it. Elijah approached. Ash glanced up. You ever heard of Cormac Bell? Elijah nodded. Owned Bell's Wash before the Wetherell boys ran him out, killed in a barn fire. Josette passed Elijah a yellowed ledger. He didn't die in that fire. He was shot through the gut, left crawling toward the stream. We have a letter from his daughter, hidden in a hymnal for 20 years. Elijah read the page. Neat script smudged at the corners. It spoke of fear, of a night when masked men came and carved through land like it was theirs by blood. So what now? Elijah asked. Ash answered without looking at him. We make it right, and if it can't be made right, we make it remembered. That week the preacher's barn was burned down. He claimed lightning. The sky had been clear. Then the schoolhouse was broken into. Nothing taken, just a crude drawing carved into the blackboard, 2 cattle horns and a dollar sign between them, a warning. Elijah fixed the board and said nothing. But the message wasn't meant for him. It was meant for Ash, and Ash finally answered. He rode out to the edge of Low Bluff, stood on the ridge, and lit a fire so bright it could be seen from every porch in Tether's End. Next morning, a wooden sign hung over the cafe door, nailed clean through with hand-forged spikes. Property reclaimed. No name, no initials, just the words. They rang louder than a gunshot. After that, lines were drawn. Men who'd shaken Ash's hand now crossed the street to avoid him. Others came closer, those with memories, with lands stolen and never returned. Elijah saw a pattern form, subtle at first, but then too plain to ignore. The dispossessed were gathering. Old Theo James, who'd lost his grazing rights to a forged lease in 1869, started fixing his fence line again. Clara Mudge, whose father's spring house had been burned out in the cattle wars, began writing letters to the land office. It wasn't just revenge, it was return. The land was shifting again, and Ash was the weight at its center. Elijah didn't take sides, not outwardly, but he began keeping a record, a ledger of changes, who moved where, which fences rose or fell, which wells ran clearer than they had in years. He wrote it in a separate book, kept under the floorboards of the schoolhouse. He wasn't sure why at first, but something told him history was repeating, and this time someone had to write it down right. One day in late June, Ash came to him as the sun set behind the peaks, his coat dusty, his eyes lit like flint. "They know who I am now." Elijah nodded. "Who told them?" "Doesn't matter, word's out. The hollow brand is back." Elijah stiffened. The hollow brand had been legend, ruthless, massive, built on swift justice and tight control. Before the war, before the burning. Ash said, "They thought I died with it, but I only buried the name." Not the claim. That night shots were fired outside Miller's barn. Josette was grazed in the arm. Ash returned fire with a rifle that hadn't been seen in this valley for 20 years. By dawn, one man was dead, not Ash, not Josette. A ranch hand sent by the sons of Wetherell to deliver a threat. The sheriff made a half-hearted inquiry. The body was buried in unmarked soil. Elijah taught school the next day, but no child met his eye. Even the wind seemed to move quieter through the windows. Tether's End had shifted. It wasn't just a town anymore. It was a fault line. And Ash, who had once sat down at a stranger's table with snow on his coat and nothing to his name, had begun to carve a new legacy, not with gold or law, but with memory. And vengeance. By July, the grass turned brittle. Storms passed without rain, leaving the soil cracked and white. Wells dipped low. A summer drought like this hadn't bitten the valley in over a decade. Folks said it was punishment, others called it justice. But none of them said Ash's name above a whisper. At the edge of town, 2 fences went up, one around Hollow Brand's reclaimed land, another around the Wetherell cattle grounds. Parallel lines of possession, armed men posted at both ends, and in between them, the town, caught in the slow grind of history trying to rewrite itself. Elijah taught on, but the pupils were restless. Their fathers drank earlier, their mothers stared longer at the hills. Tether's End had always lived on the margin, but now the margin was folding in. That week the mayor vanished, left in the middle of the night, house emptied. Only the sheriff seemed surprised. Josette took to riding into Casper, then Sheridan, drawing maps from memory, gathering testimony from the forgotten. She returned with names and deeds, and once, a letter written in 1855 by Ash's grandfather, land grants scribbled beneath the ink. But Ash remained in Tether's End. He moved like stone beneath water, weighty and slow, yet impossible to ignore. He rarely spoke anymore. He didn't need to. One afternoon, Elijah found him in the schoolyard, leaning against the porch rail. "You keep records," Ash said without turning. Elijah nodded. "I do." "Keep them safe. When this ends, no one'll remember it clean." Elijah watched him. "And how will it end?" Ash was silent. Then, "I reckon someone burns. I just don't know who yet." That night a blaze lit the southern ridge. Not wildfire, controlled, deliberate. A branding flame, burning out an old cattle yard owned by the sons of Isaac Wetherell. No one died, but the message was clear. Next morning the Wetherell boys sent 3 men into town, hired shooters. Eastern coats, polished spurs. They drank at the bar and waited for Ash. Ash never showed. Instead, Josette walked into the saloon and laid out a rolled parchment on their table. She said nothing. One of the men stood to grab it. She placed a hand on his wrist. "Look closer," she told him, "before you make yourself useful to the wrong side." They left town before dusk, all three. The sheriff came to Elijah 2 days later, asked questions in a tired voice. "Do you know what hollow brand was built on before the war?" Elijah answered, "Honor, I heard." The sheriff shook his head. "Control, tightest in the West. But not cruel. People feared Ash's father, but they didn't hate him, because he fed them, paid his debts, left widows richer than husbands." He scratched his beard. "That kind of power don't die easy. Not even when you kill the man." Elijah waited. "You think Ash is becoming him?" The sheriff looked up. "No, I think Ash is doing what his father never did, taking names." At the summer festival, thinner now, with fewer stalls and no band, Ash stood alone by the edge of the square. Children didn't approach him, even dogs passed wide, but one man did. Harlan Cobb, 73 years old, former ranch foreman of the Daltrey Range. He hadn't walked without a cane in years, yet he made his way to Ash and said loud enough for all to hear, "It should have been you. Should have never gone the way it did." Ash didn't reply, just touched the brim of his hat. After that, others came. Slowly, one by one, not allies, not quite friends, but people with memory. People who'd survived the purge of '68 and still bore the teeth marks of what was taken. A new alliance was forming, not made of power but of grievance, and the Wetherells saw it. 2 weeks later, Theo James was found dead in his pasture, throat cut. No money taken, nothing disturbed, just a warning. The next day, Josette brought Elijah a satchel of documents. "If something happens to me, give these to the press in Denver. And if they won't take them, bury them deep, but not so deep they can't be found." Elijah took them. He didn't ask what they contained. He didn't want to know. But he did ask one thing. "Why are you staying? You could leave. You've done your part." Josette sat beside him, her face unreadable. "I knew a girl once, burned out of her family's land at 9. They told her to forget it. To be thankful she survived." She looked at the schoolhouse, the children filing out like shadows across dust. She grew up waiting for someone to come back and make them remember. "I stay because he did." That evening, Ash gathered 4 men, men who bore no title, only memory, and rode north. Elijah didn't ask where, didn't sleep that night either. They returned at dawn. 2 of them bleeding, one riderless horse trailing behind. Ash walked into the cafe, sat where he always had, ordered black coffee. When Mrs. Leary asked if he was all right, he nodded once. "There's less evil in the hills than there was yesterday," he said. Elijah sat across from him 10 minutes later. Neither man spoke. They didn't need to, because the tide had turned, and the flood was only beginning. August came like a fever. The valley shimmered with heat, and the dust off the wagon trails hung in the air like smoke that wouldn't settle. Every man walked with his head low and his hand near his belt. Crops wilted. Wells stayed shallow. But it wasn't the weather that made people nervous. It was the silence before a reckoning. No one said Wetherell aloud anymore. Their sons kept to the high trails, too proud to run, too scared to step into town. Riders passed through at night, strangers with blank brands and twitchy horses. Someone was building toward something, and everyone felt it coming like thunder in the bones. Elijah taught fewer children now. Some families had gone east, others sent their young to cousins inland. The schoolhouse sat too quiet during midday, and the church bell hadn't been rung in a fortnight. He found Ash one morning outside the blacksmith's, sharpening a blade that didn't look made for cattle. The steel was clean but old, the kind of edge that remembered. I hear Wetherell's boys have hired men from Utah, Elijah said, watching sparks fly. Ash nodded once. I know, 3 are already here. 4th's coming by rail. You plan to meet them. I don't plan anything, Ash said, testing the weight of the blade. I answer what's asked. Josette had stopped riding to the cities. She stayed close now, eyes sharp, coat patched at the elbow. She no longer carried papers. She carried a revolver low on her hip, tied to her thigh. People noticed. One Sunday, during what passed for a sermon these days, the preacher paused halfway through Corinthians and said, "There's no peace without truth, but there sure as hell ain't no truth without a fight." Half the congregation walked out. The other half stayed and listened. That same afternoon, 2 horses were found dead on the trail near Bell's Wash. Shot clean through the eye, stripped of saddle. Their riders were never named. The town understood what the message meant: hollow brand, hollow justice, hollow graves. Elijah began to wonder if Ash would survive it. He seemed to be changing, not in body, but in weight. Like the longer he stayed, the less he could leave. He was tying himself to the dirt, one decision at a time. Josette cornered Elijah one night outside the cafe. She didn't smile anymore, not even out of habit. "They're planning something," she said. "Wetherell's boys, big, maybe tomorrow, maybe next week, but they're gathering arms and mouths." "How many?" Elijah asked. "Enough to call it war." And still Ash sat in that same booth, drinking his black coffee, eating stew like a man without a deadline. When Elijah finally asked him why he didn't strike first, Ash only said, "Because they've forgotten what it feels like to start something they can't finish. I aim to teach them." That night, Elijah unlocked the floorboards of the schoolhouse and added more to the ledger. Not just facts now, names, dates, blood. A record not only of justice, but of consequence. He didn't think of himself as a chronicler, he thought of himself as a witness. The day it began was hot and windless. A dust veil hung over Tether's End, and the crows circled low. At noon, a rider came galloping into town. Hat gone, shirt torn at the shoulder, one of Miller's hands. "They're coming," he rasped. 30 strong, guns, wagons, more men behind them. No one asked who they were. Ash rose from the cafe, walked into the middle of the road, and waited. Josette followed. Then Harlan Cobb, walking without his cane. Then Mrs. Clara Mudge, rifle in hand. Then 2 boys not old enough to vote, but old enough to carry scars. Elijah stood beside the schoolhouse, notebook in one pocket, pistol in the other. He had never killed a man. He wasn't sure if he would. But he knew what side he stood on. The dust cloud came first, then the silhouettes. Then the sound of hooves like thunder dragged sideways. And then they were there, 30 men with hard eyes and quiet mouths, pulling up just shy of the main street. Wetherell's sons led them, clean boots, polished buttons, hands twitching like hounds on chains. "You don't belong here," the eldest said, voice loud enough for every porch to hear. Ash stepped forward, no rifle, no armor. Just him and his name. "I belong where the land remembers me, where my people died, where your father buried what he stole." The sons sneered, "You got no title." "I got memory, I got blood, and I got fire. That's all it ever took." No warning shot, no parley, just the crack of a rifle and the scream of a horse, and then it started. The street became a battlefield, gunfire from rooftops, smoke spilling from alleyways. The Wetherell men fired wild, expecting surrender, but Tether's End had changed. It had learned how to remember. Josette moved like wind between buildings, dropping one shooter at a time. Ash didn't draw till it was necessary, and when he did, it was final. 3 men fell before they even saw the draw. Elijah stayed behind cover, but when a man climbed the schoolhouse steps with a pistol aimed through the window, Elijah fired once and didn't miss. His hand shook for an hour after. By the time the dust settled, 12 of them lay dead, 7 wounded, the rest fled. The Wethrell sons were not among the dead. They crawled into the dirt and dropped their guns and begged. Ash stood over them, his face unreadable. "This ain't revenge," he told them. "It's reclamation." Then he turned and walked away. The town didn't cheer. Tether's End wasn't a place for celebration. It was a place for surviving what came next. And what came next was quieter, but not easier. They buried the bodies at the north edge of town, in the same field where prairie dogs used to scurry and kids once hunted lizards with sticks. Josette read no scripture, but she stood over each grave with her hands clasped like she was holding the sky back. Ash carved no names into the markers, just lines, 1 line for each death. "They chose it," was all he said. After the shootout, the Wetherell sons were escorted to the edge of the Hollow Brand boundary and sent riding east with a bag of rations and the clothes they wore. They didn't look back. No one in town expected them to return. The land had changed under their feet, and they'd lost the thread that once kept them above the law. Tether's End didn't celebrate, didn't sing, but fences were repaired and shutters pulled open for the first time in months. Ash rebuilt the bell tower on the church. He didn't say why. Elijah resumed his lessons. Smaller class, quieter days. The children had learned too much too early, and it showed in the way they moved, flinched at thunder, sat straighter when a horse passed too close to the window. In late August, Josette came to the schoolhouse after dismissal. She carried a new map and laid it on Elijah's desk. "What is it?" he asked. She pointed. "Water rights, grazing claims, everything that ever belonged to Hollow Brand. Now legitimized, titles registered in Cheyenne. Ash owns all of it again." Elijah traced the lines with his finger. The ranch stretched beyond what he expected, thousands of acres, winding through hill and gulch, deep into places no one had settled since before the war. "You helped him do this," he said. She nodded. "I gave him the paper, he gave me the fire." Josette stayed a few more days, then packed her horse and rode out before sunrise. No goodbyes, just a letter under Elijah's door. "Teach them truth, or they'll learn lies that kill." The Hollow Brand spread open slowly, not with a hired army or steel gates, but with quiet order. Ash appointed caretakers, widows, old ranch hands, families who'd been cast out in the burning days. He didn't ask for tribute, he asked for stewardship, and yet no one doubted who owned it. Ash didn't build a mansion or take a title. He kept to the small house by the old windmill where the land rose enough to see every fence he'd reclaimed. Every acre was a memory, every pasture a ledger. One evening, Elijah brought him a bottle of rye and sat beside him on the porch. "You've got it all back," Elijah said, "every last thing." Ash drank once, everything but time. They sat a while. Then Elijah asked the question he'd been holding all summer. "Why'd you sit with me that first day, in the cafe?" Ash didn't answer at first. The wind carried the sound of cattle lowing in the distance. "Because you weren't afraid of silence," Ash said finally, "and you didn't ask what I'd done to deserve being alone." Elijah nodded. He didn't press further. The sheriff retired a week later, rode west with his pension and a bottle of bitters. Said he'd seen enough history. Elijah wasn't so lucky. One morning he found a girl waiting outside the schoolhouse. 11, maybe 12, dust on her cheeks, a scar beneath her collarbone. She handed him a folded note. "Ash said you'd know what to do." The note was short, just a name. Elijah opened the door. The girl said nothing all day, but she listened. And when he spoke about truth, her eyes locked on his like they'd been starved of it. She stayed. Slept in the cot behind the supply shelves, ate when offered but never asked for seconds. By the 3rd week, she began writing in the blank books Elijah kept for the older students. Careful letters, sharp lines, not a word about her past. But once Elijah glimpsed what she'd drawn in the margins. A man on horseback, silhouetted against fire. Ash didn't come to town for weeks after that. When he did, he brought a new horse, notched at the ear, with a strange brand no one recognized. He tied it outside the schoolhouse. "She's ready to ride," he told Elijah, "when she wants." Elijah looked at the girl, then at Ash. "What are you building?" he asked. Ash didn't look at him. His eyes were on the sky. "Something they can't burn." And then he left, riding toward the rim where the land broke wide and the wind didn't carry names anymore. Tether's End went back to its rhythm. A little harder, a little wiser. The land bore new brands. The maps were rewritten, but in the minds of those who lived there, one truth lingered. A man had come with nothing but silence and old scars. A teacher let him sit down, and because of that, the West was made to remember what it tried to forget. The girl stayed, and others like her came. By fall, Elijah added a second bench to his classroom and kept his door unlocked. The first frost of autumn etched the window panes in silence. Mist curled through the valley at dawn, silvering the hills, softening the scars carved in wood and stone. The land looked cleansed, but Elijah knew better. Nothing was ever truly clean, just quieter. He kept teaching. Fewer lessons from the book now, more from memory. He told the children how rivers claimed their own path, how wind wore down mountains one grain at a time. When they asked about Hollow Brand, he didn't give stories. He gave questions. What's the difference between justice and memory? When does a name become a weapon? How do you carry the truth without letting it break your back? The girl, her name turned out to be Ruth, rarely spoke in class. But she listened with a fury Elijah had only seen once before. In Ash. One evening, Ruth stayed behind while the others filtered home. She waited until the room was empty before approaching Elijah's desk. "When do I get to write it down?" she asked. He looked at her. Her hands were ink-stained, her shoulders too thin for her age, but her eyes were full of steadiness. Elijah unlocked the drawer and pulled out the black ledger, the one he'd kept hidden since the winter Ash first walked into town. He laid it on the desk. "You write it when you've seen enough to know what came before still matters." Ruth nodded once. Then she sat, opened the book to a blank page, and began writing. Ash didn't return that month. Word drifted in from travelers, though, of a man matching his shape and gait, riding along the southern range, visiting orphaned homesteads and abandoned claims, fixing wells, paying old debts. He never signed his name, but the people knew. The man who once lost everything had become something more than owner, more than legend. He'd become continuity, Josette wrote once. A letter from Nevada stamped in dust. He's building something, not a ranch, not even a legacy. He's giving them a place to stand when the storms come. That's the real war. Elijah read it 3 times, then burned it. The truth didn't need to be passed in letters anymore. It was alive, planted deep. In early November, the railroad surveyors came. Smart suits, smarter mouths. They offered money, maps, and guarantees of prosperity. They spoke to Hollow Brand stewards. They spoke to Elijah, but Ash they never found. When they asked who owned the land, Elijah only said, "The land owns itself now." They didn't like that answer. They left by sundown. Later, Elijah found Ruth drawing rail lines in the margins of her practice slate, then crossing them out, one by one. Winter approached again. Early snow whispered across the bluffs. The cattle stayed closer to the lowlands. People closed their shutters tight. Elijah walked the town each evening after class, past the cafe where Ash once sat, past the church with its new bell, past the half-burned fence line where he'd shot a man and buried the reason deep. He stopped on a ridge above Hollow Brand, where the wind still spoke like an old friend. From there he could see everything Ash had rebuilt, and farther beyond that, what Ash had left unclaimed, untouched, space for those not yet born, for names not yet scarred. That night he dreamed of the day Ash first sat across from him. Snow melting off his coat, hand steady, eyes quiet. And Elijah remembered what struck him most, not the man's silence, not even his sorrow, but the way he waited, like he already knew how the story would end. Weeks passed. One dawn, before the frost broke, Ruth came to Elijah's cabin with her coat buttoned wrong and ash on her sleeve. "He's back," she said. Elijah rose without speaking, followed her to the ridge. Ash stood beneath a dead tree, reins in one hand, rifle slung. Older now, leaner, but solid. He looked out across the land he had once been forced to flee. He didn't speak, neither did Elijah. Ruth broke the silence. "What comes next?" Ash didn't look at her. He just answered, quiet and low, "Whatever you decide to build from what we carried." He left again that same day, not as a fugitive, not even as a figure of fear. He left as something closer to myth, a man who took back what was his without ever asking permission, a man who sat once at a stranger's table and from that seat built the foundation of a new West, not with laws, not with guns, but with memory. Elijah returned to the schoolhouse, lit the stove, sat at his desk, and beside him Ruth kept writing, not just what had happened, but what still could. The last chapter was not his to write. But the fire that began with a simple kindness, a seat shared on a cold day, would burn through generations. And in the margin of the black ledger, written in Ruth's careful hand, was the final entry. The richest man in the West left behind no throne, only a place to begin again.